Hi, everyone. We're very excited to get started today. We are at the top of the hour, but we're going to go ahead and let some more people trickle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And then we'll make it chatty while we wait for a few more minutes. If you want, go ahead and post maybe your location, where you're located, and if you're a current customer, who you are in the webinar chat so that some of our participants can see who's here. Give it about one more minute here. It looks like chat is disabled. So our friends behind the scenes, can you make sure you fix that before we get started? I was gonna say we have a quiet crowd. I didn't see anyone chatting about where they are. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we'll get started. Before we do so, I just want to run through some quick housekeeping items. So today we are going to be directing open questions or questions in general to our Q&A section of the webinar. We are going to encourage a lot of chat in the actual webinar chat. So we love feedback. We love commentary. We love emojis. Let's go ahead and post those in the webinar chat. We're going to make sure that everyone's already set on mute, but if you happen to accidentally unswitch that, if you can, let's go ahead and make sure we keep there. And then finally, for an optimal connection, we just recommend using your computer audio instead of telephone. So let's go ahead and get started today. I'm a new face to webinars, so I'll go ahead and first start and introduce myself. My name is Kaitlyn Debelak, and in the theme of what I asked earlier in the webinar chat, I'm located in Columbus, Ohio, in the Midwest here in the United States. So while I'm giving my introduction, if we could have our participants go ahead and post where you're from, where are you joining us from, and if you're a customer, what company you're with. So again, Kaitlyn Debelak here, Head of Customer Success at Torii. I'm really excited to be here with Steve to talk about one of my favorite parts of our capability. This is the hidden gems of using advanced techniques with our automations. But quickly, for those that are new to Torii, either as a customer, potentially someone that's evaluating our capability, let me run through what is Torii in just a quick spiel. So we're your single solution for managing your entire SaaS ecosystem. That's a pretty big claim, and you're probably wondering, how can I make such a claim? Well, Torii works hard to constantly discover all of your SaaS applications. Yes, even the ones that your employees purposefully try to hide. That's what we call shadow IT over here at Torii. Since we have all of the data around all those applications we've discovered, we're going to be able to reduce your blind spots into contracts and license use. Finally, our capability is going to allow you to automate some of those more manual tasks associated with managing your growing tech stack. So we'll talk through some of those things today, but primarily we're going to focus in on those automations. So to summarize, with Torii, you have a clear understanding of all of the applications that are being used inside and outside of your IDP. Of those applications, which one have paid licenses and which ones are not? Where are the cost savings for unused licenses? Maybe we have duplicate applications, we want to be aware of that. When are these applications up for renewal? What are the terms? Am I dealing with auto renewal here? And then finally, how can I automate all of the above that I just talked about? And let's go ahead and tack on employee onboarding and offboarding, which is a perfect transition into our topic today, which Steve here is going to help us run through.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kaitlyn. Okay, yeah, so as Kaitlyn had mentioned, I'm going to walk through the workflow automation capabilities within Torii. And what I'm going to start with is just a little bit of review. I'm not going to spend too much time on this of the actual workflows, how our workflows work. And then I want to get into some of these advanced workflow topics that we have been talking about. And for those that do not know me, I'm Steve. I am one of the solution engineers here at Torii, and I am based in Toronto, Canada. Okay, so here we go. So let's start a little bit with the triggers. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but essentially, workflows in Torii are going to run based on some type of trigger. These triggers could be a user attribute, a user identity. These are your user lifecycle management triggers. An attribute is set to this, therefore this workflow is going to run, or you've now joined the company, left the company, etc. Then you've got your selection of application triggers. These are going to be your new apps that you have in your org, or an app that's not in your IDP, or an app with a specific, level of expense or contract. These are your application triggers. Then, of course, you've got your license triggers, and your license triggers are essentially, you have somebody that has a license, they haven't used their license, right? And then we're going to do something. And then, of course, you've got your contract triggers. We've got a great renewal management part of the platform. If a contract is coming up for expiration, you then have the ability to leverage the contract triggers. And then we've got some real-time triggers and, of course, the custom triggers, the webhooks. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a few of the pre-built triggers that I've done, and then I'm going to get into some of the little bit more of the advanced stuff. So this is an onboarding trigger. Now, an onboarding trigger in my case is built with some type of criteria. Now, this criteria in my case is going to be looking at, okay, my environment's connected to Workday. And I'm going to be looking for anytime I have a new user in my environment, and that hire date is 2 days from now. So our workflows run every hour. Now, when this condition is finally met, we are then going to do some things, such as maybe I'm going to create that Google Workspace account or create that Azure account. And then maybe I'm going to continue with whatever birthright access that I want to do, creating a Slack account, creating a Zoom account, etc. Then I'm going to start to get into branching. Now, branching in my case is going to be looking at the data we got from Workday. In this case, we have a Workday department attribute set. So I'm going to have different conditions or different branches based on the specific department that is set for this particular user that came in from the Workday sync that you have with Torii. So in this case, if I'm in the sales team, I'm going to create a bunch of birthright access, creating a Salesforce account. Maybe I have an approval before I gain access to specific groups. I then can follow a different path if I'm in the marketing team or the finance team. Maybe I'm managing group memberships in my Okta environment. Right? So this is building out a flow based on the different departments that I am in from that it came in from Workday. Now, there are tons of different actions that you can do. We see a lot of different capabilities that we have within our platform. But what if there is an action that is not available? That's where we give you this capability to do custom actions. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail right now because we're going to go into custom actions quite in detail a little bit later on in today's webinar. But building out the onboarding is step one. Now, the bigger item might be for most organizations is that offboarding. Now, in offboarding, I have that criteria as well, such as that end date is today. Now, earlier I mentioned that our workflows run every hour. So what we want to be careful about is we don't want to deprovision that user before they complete their last day of work. So what I do is I add a little bit of another location-based attribute or criteria to this workflow, and then I set the schedule time. I only want to run this workflow at the end of the day. Now, when this condition is finally met, so this runs at 8 p.m., then what am I going to do? Well, maybe I'm going to update the Google Workspace email. I'm going to suspend the account. I'll possibly add an email alias to the manager, sign them out of their sessions. And then I might do a bunch of other things. And then I'm going to start the offboarding. Right now, what start the offboarding means is we're going to run that default offboarding action that we have configured on the application. I'm not going to really get into that right now, but on each app, you can configure a default offboarding action, such as Salesforce is deactivate. Zoom might be to disable that account. We may also continue and do some other advanced things, such as transferring Docs and Drive data, transferring calendar data. All right, there's a lot of different capabilities that you can do both within the Google and in the Microsoft environments as well, including adding wait conditions along the way if you wanted to delay a process, run a task, wait a day or two, or wait a few hours and go from there. Now, let's talk a little bit about licenses. Now, obviously, we're using Torii to manage our licenses, and we want to be able to deprovision licenses. So what we define here is, well, what is the criteria that I'm going to remove licenses? In this case, I have my workflow set to 90 days. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to select my license types. In this case, I'm running this for 2 specific Office 365 licenses. Now, removing licenses is never going to be a one-size-fits-all. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm building out that branch again. And the first thing I might do is maybe there's a certain set of users that I don't want to remove access. So that's this branch. Then maybe there's that next set of users where we want to make this interactive. So I might send a Slack message to the user and say, hey, we noticed you haven't used your Office 365 licenses in 90 days. Can we reclaim your licenses? It costs us, maybe $500 a year for these particular license. And then in Slack, they can choose, yeah, you can have that license back, or no, I want to keep that license. If they say you can have the license back, I'm going to remove that license, either direct or maybe via my Okta environment or my Azure environment, what have you. If they say, no, I want to keep that license, maybe it ends. Or maybe you do another approval that goes to the HR line manager just to double verify that we are going to let them keep their license. But maybe that last group of people, we don't give them that option. We don't make it interactive. We go ahead and we remove the access only because, hey, we can remove that access, but Torii is an app catalog as well that allows them to request that access back.
Okay, so what Steve just went through is a great example of the more basic, our 3 foundational workflows. These are things that I'd hope a lot of our participants already have set up in their environment. And if they don't, then go talk to your CSM, right? If you have questions about this, I want to build this, this is something that I need, we're here to help you. You don't have to guess and do this yourself. And so reach out to your CSM. But I think one big thing we want to talk about today is advanced workflows. So once you've already built out some of these basic ones, how can you really change how you're using Torii to make it fully extensible to everything that you have in your ecosystem? So, Steve, most of what I saw in those 3 workflows was pretty relatable. I recognized some of the applications and generally things are the same. But I, at my company, have a really highly customized flow, or maybe we want to start our onboarding process from an unconventional location. Torii recognizes that one size doesn't fit all. So with this, we're going to recommend the use of a custom trigger webhooks. And that's what Steve is going to go through. So Steve, can you show us how webhooks will allow our users to build a complete end-to-end automation, regardless of your organization's process or ecosystem? And before you get started, I want to call out that this is a really great thing to start to pay attention to, because some of our customers already have onboarding and offboarding workflows built in other solutions. And maybe those scenarios are pieced together, right? You have gaps, and those gaps need filled to create a more efficient process. This advanced stuff that Steve is going to walk through might ultimately be a better solution, or it may fill some gaps that you have in Torii by just using basic workflows. So pay close attention, ask questions. We're really excited to show this to you.
Okay, so let's get into webhooks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start and build one from scratch. Now, when you build a webhook, what's going to happen here is we are going to, first of all, give you that URL that is going to be that webhook URL. Now, we've made this easy when it comes down to what are the data points that you need to send. Now, we're going to get into the API docs in a second, and with most APIs, you need to know, well, what do I have to send? What can I send? Do I send the first name? Do I send the last name? Do I send the department, cost center, job title, what have you? Now, the way we've designed this is it doesn't matter. So let's walk through this. And what I'm going to use when we walk through this, I'm going to use Postman to demonstrate how this is going to work. So I've got a URL here that Torii has generated. I'm going to copy that URL. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my Postman environment here. Okay, and I'm going to paste in that URL that I got. And here it is. Now I predefined some JSON, but this JSON can be anything that I want it to be. So let's say in this case, I'm sending information into Torii. Okay, and I'm just going to swap back out and get back over here. Now, the way the webhook works, so we don't have to pre-build a schema that you need to send, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click this little test trigger button. Okay, now it's waiting for a request that we're going to send. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to send this request. Okay. Now, after I send this request, I'm going to get a response that says this was good, and also the type is set to test. Now I'm going to hop back into Torii, and I see that, okay, well, here's the JSON that I provided. And now I've got a first name, I've got a last name, I've got an email. Now, all these here are personalization tokens that you can automatically use. Let me jump right back to Postman again. Okay, now let's say that I want to add a department. Okay, so I'm going to come here and I'm going to add department. Okay, now I can add really whatever attribute I want to add and just make sure that is available. So now I added department. I can even rename this. This was title. I would prefer this to be called job title, right? Now, before I send this, again, I got to go back to Torii and I've got to put this back in test mode. Okay, so now that this is in test mode, I can come here and I can make that request. Okay, I got back a response, and then there we go. Here is my new attribute, my new personalization token called job title, and I got a department now. So now it really doesn't matter what that next action is going to be, whether it is, creating an account, whether it is sending a message, what have you, right? I can now use these values inside of the personalization tokens.
So Steve, this is cool, but it's kind of a hypothetical test scenario, right? I think our participants would love to see it working in a real life scenario. Can we pick maybe how this would look in like Jira, a real application we may have?
Okay, great point there, Kaitlyn. Now, whether it is Jira, whether it is Zendesk or Zoho, what have you, typically when we see the use case for the webhook, not always, but typically there's going to be some type of new hire form. that wants to be completed. So let's say I were to jump into Jira. So let's say I've got a new employee in this form, and I'm going to call James Tester, and I'm going to put J Tester and make this up. Okay, it's going to be an IT admin, and I'm going to be the department is IT, and I'm going to go ahead and set the start date to Friday. And I go ahead and I'm going to submit this request. So basically what I have configured inside of my Jira new hire form is a webhook that is going to be called. It's going to be calling Torii, and it's going to be passing that information. And I just so happen to have got a Slack that has the information that I got passed to that webhook. Now, let's go back here. I'm going to show you that webhook that I built over here. So I've got that trigger. So this is the URL that I put into this. Now, I see a question in the chat from Bill that says, what about the authentication? Now, the way the authentication works for webhooks is similar to the way authentication works for other providers that provide webhooks, is it's built into the URL. Okay, so just keep that in mind, is that the authentication is built into the URL, and now I've configured this so that I can easily go through and then take this information and then use it for whatever I want to do within here. So in this case, I just sent a Slack notification, but maybe I don't want to send a Slack notification. Maybe I want to go ahead and create the Google account, right? So I can go ahead there and create the Google account. This variable here, email, will be the user in context that I got from the email attribute here. Okay, and then as I go through and start to use here, what I'm going to see is my trigger first name. I'll see my trigger last name, right? So all the different data points that I got, I will be able to see and then be able to act on that in the variables that I'm going to be using from then. Okay. Very cool.
We've got a quick question that came in. One, you're just using Jira as an example, but I'm assuming that this could be used for any application solution that customers have.
That's right. If I wanted to create an Okta account, I can create the Okta account, right? If your question in the chat was, can Okta call our webhook? Then the answer is yes to that as well. Okay.
Right.
So the fact that we have a webhook URL here, you can choose when and how you want to use this, and then you can use it. And just keep in mind that our webhooks are designed for the user type workflows. Okay. They're designed for the user workflows. They're not for the license workflows. They're not for the application workflows. They're for the user workflows.
That's a really good tip. On the other side, if you didn't catch that, if you forget that, just again, a helpful reminder that your CSMs are here to help. And so if you want to try this yourself, you've got questions, or if you don't want to try it yourself, just reach out to your CSM and we're prepared to help you walk through this. Yes, there is some documentation, and we're actually going to walk through some additional documentation that we have. So webhook and API are used kind of interchangeably, however, very, very different things. So I know we have a lot of customers that are using our API today outside of just the custom webhook trigger, included in the ability to run a workflow via the API, just kind of like what you just showed us. So how's this different though than what you just showed us? And can you talk through using API versus custom webhook trigger?
Okay, so I might have a workflow. Let's say I have a workflow like this, right? And I have built out specific functions that are going to do. Now, if I were to, I'm just going to hop over here to our developer community. Now, in here in our developer community, we do have all the API calls that we have available. And one of those API calls is the run workflow. Now, I do have the ability to pass or use this API call from anywhere really. And all I need to do is, in this case, is pass the ID of the workflow. Hopping back into Torii, this is the ID of the workflow, that, 165133. This is the ID of my particular workflow. So what I would do is I would pass that into this. So what is the difference now between if I wanted to run this workflow versus, running it for, another workflow? So let's say I had that onboarding workflow, right? I could take this ID and use this API call to trigger that workflow. Now, the difference in your decision to choose webhook versus run workflow, the difference is going to be is when I run this workflow from this API call, I'm expecting that user to already be in Torii. If that user does not exist in Torii, meaning we're running it from this new hire form, then I want to use the webhook. Okay, so that webhook basically is going to then allow me to create that Google account, create that Zoom account, Slack account, what have you, and then let the typical syncs happen from Torii to bring that data back. So the APIs are great. You can run application workflows, you can run license workflows, you can run new app request workflows, all using the APIs that we have listed over here. Okay.
Great. Okay, so how do we use the API though, or how do we know that it will work with our custom action? So you kind of had mentioned when to use each one and how are they different, but do they work together?
Okay, so let's talk about custom actions. Okay, so custom actions, as I mentioned in this initial onboarding workflow, is a way for you to call different APIs that we may not have the actions for in Torii, or they may be because you want to do a little bit more. So let's talk about custom actions. Now, initially, I talked about webhooks, and that was more of an incoming webhook. Okay, so that is you are calling our webhook. Now, I want to talk about outgoing. Okay, and that's what custom actions are. Is in this case, I know we already have Torii, we have an out-of-the-box ticket creation system. So I just want to demonstrate here what I would do in the case of calling an outbound, whether it was a webhook that existed in Freshdesk or in Okta or whatever, or I was just going to call an API. So now what I can do is read up, grab a little bit about, hey, what is the API that I want to call? In this case, I've got the URL that I need to call to create a Freshdesk ticket. I have defined the authorization header. Now, this is a static header here, and I've got my API key in my secret vault. Now, here what I've done is I've just decided, I've looked at the API doc and said, what do I need to send to this particular application? So in this case, I have called their API to create a ticket, and I'm passing in these environment variables here. Now, I also have the ability to take the response of this and be able to use that in an upcoming or a subsequent API call. Now, Kaitlyn asked about, custom actions and how do we know whether or not a custom action will work within Torii. Now, you can use custom actions for a lot of different things. It could be a GraphQL as well as, JSON as well. You can, post whatever we need to send. But what this comes down to is this authorization header. And the authorization header, in this case, what I would typically do is I would look at a particular set of documentation. And in this case, I would go to Freshdesk and I'd say, well, what is the authentication that I need to do? Is this some type of static token? So I see great, I can use some type of static token. Okay. And then I'd be able to use that and then bring that back into the secret vault. And then I can use that in here. Okay. So the custom action allows me to make this API call and then pass whatever I need to send. And then you have that option of using the response. Let's jump to the response. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is an example here of working with the Okta API. Now, I know that we have a default action to add a user into a group. So this is just particular for demonstration purposes. What I'm doing here is I'm going to use the get method in this custom action, and I'm going to call the Okta API. And in here, I'm going to pass in the email address from this particular custom action. I've got my API key in my secret vault. But what I'm doing here is I've created a response mapping. Now, that response mapping is going to take the value that I got from Okta in this API call, and I called this variable Okta ID. Now, in the next API call, what I'm doing is I'm going to use that variable here in the next call. So that is a way of using the different responses and be able to act on that in a subsequent API call.
I believe Bill kind of started to allude to this via a question he asked, and I hope we can answer it this way. But I'm curious, Steve, if you can walk through how our users can expand these automation capabilities to external systems that support OAuth.
Okay. Now, OAuth is, so there are different types of authorizations for OAuth. Now, the most common is an OAuth authorization code grant flow. Now, an authorization code grant flow is more of an interactive, where you need to ask for the consent, you provide the authorization, and then you get an authorization code. We use that code when we grab a token. Now, an authorization code grant flow is not supported in our custom action. Unless you can get a very long-lived token, but that's going to be something that I'm not going to really recommend when it comes down to that. Now, the other option really is a client credentials flow. Now, I'm going to show you an example here of creating a Zoho ticket. Now, when I create a Zoho ticket, okay, I am going to call the Zoho API, and I've created a client ID. I created a secret. Yeah, I should have put this in the secret vault. And what I'm doing here is I'm doing a post to the Zoho API, and I'm getting a token back from Zoho, and I'm going to store it in this variable. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the next API call. This is the API to create a ticket in the into Zoho Desk. And I'm going to use that Zoho ticket in the authorization header. So now I'm able to grab that response, and then I can create that ticket. So it's being able to use the response from this first call, which is an OAuth client credentials flow, and be able to use that in a subsequent action. Okay.
All right, so this gave me some ideas of how we could help some of our existing customers. I want to quickly survey, without a formal survey, the participants. Can you give me a thumbs up in the chat if this gave you some ideas, if you're not using some of the advanced techniques that Steve had worked through, and you're interested in looking into these. Outside of these ones, we did want to also talk through some more use cases that our customers have shared with us that are probably a little bit more unique than some of these more, generic advanced techniques. So the first one we want to talk about is that ideally all stakeholders would work directly in Torii, but we understand that's a big ask. And we're all constantly working to get everybody to access and understand and things like that. But, we don't want to not maintain existing processes just because all individuals aren't using Torii. So let's go ahead and solve for this. And how can we use Torii to automatically, for example, maybe update external tools like a Notion or a Google Sheets?
Okay.
especially useful for maybe if you've got hybrid tech stacks and you're tracking things that are on premise versus just SaaS, etc. So this is kind of a more unique but necessary automation.
Okay, so what I've shown you so far have been very simple custom actions. Now let's take a look at a very advanced custom action. Now, in this case right here, what I'm going to show is a custom action that the purpose of this is to populate a Notion database every time we have a contract that is coming up for renewal. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm going to call a Notion API. So I've had to read the Notion API docs to say, okay, well, what is the API that I need to call? And then what I'm going to do is a very detailed API call in the sense that I'm calling exactly what Notion wants to populate each of the different fields that we have in a particular database. So what's going to happen is after I run this, I'm going to pop over here and I'm going to get a Notion database, which is going to have the contract name, the emails, whether or not there was an auto renewal, the start date, the end date. Now, really the key, and then obviously I got that back, the link back into Torii, to go back and be able to see the actual contract directly back in Torii. Now, the key here as well, this is a little bit more advanced, but it's also understanding, first of all, what are all the fields in my database? And then get a good understanding of what is the API call that I need to do here. Now, this could be a contract that's coming up for renewal. These could be onboarding tasks. There's a lot of organizations that use Notion in very different ways, but another way of just doing a little bit more of an advanced API call using the custom actions capability. Okay, now the next one that I wanted to show you is a little bit of a different use case that came across. And this use case was more about having some type of control and some external system just to track the licenses that are not in use. So let's kind of walk through this flow right here. So I got a workflow that's going to have a license not in use. And I'm actually going to run this. Let's actually run this workflow. I'll just pick any random user here, and I'll pick the license, and I'll run that particular workflow. Okay, so my workflow here is an approval process. Okay, so I go into my Slack and I got an approval that says, hey, we noticed you haven't used your Asana license in a while. Can we reclaim your license? But I'm like, no, I want to keep my license. Okay, so what's happening here though is I'm going to hop back here is I've got a custom action that I want to call to a Google Sheet. Okay, and this Google Sheet is going to pass in the application, the license name, and the description. In this case, it was declined. So when I hop over to my Google Sheet, here I see that, oh, I've called this Google Sheet and say, oh, there's an Asana license. It was declined by this individual, and this is the timestamp. And this is basically just having some code that runs on the Google Sheet that's waiting for a post that I can send this post and it's going to pass this information down and have a separate item. Now, this Google Sheet could have been used for contracts. It could have been used, for new apps in here. Basically, it's allowing Torii to keep up and update those external systems so that, everything is still maintained in Torii, but you also may want subsequent processes or pre-existing processes in a different product.
And secretly, maybe this is the way to reverse engineer getting these stakeholders interested in Torii for them asking, how are these things up to date, right? What processes and having them then log in. So, all right, before Q&A, a quick section. I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of 3 new features that I hand selected because I think they're really relevant to what we talked about today. This is going to make your experience of building out workflows and managing workflows a lot better. Number one, stop workflows. And I'm going to ask, we're going to do hearts if you've used these yet since they've been released. And then we're going to do maybe the big eye emojis for if you were unaware that these things were live in Torii. Gives us a little bit of pulse on whether or not we're doing a good job communicating some of our new features. So stop workflows. We really understand that priorities change, tasks become irrelevant, and now we've released, as of the new year, users can stop workflows mid-process. So that we don't have to fully execute them. You can go in and make changes. Anybody aware of this part? Again, if this is new and you're going to use it and you're excited, give us the big eyes. All right, next one, restore workflow history. So we know mistakes happen and maybe you need to restore a previous workflow. We also know that a lot of our customers have several different users that can actually edit workflows in an environment. So this new capability allows you to easily revert to any prior version directly from the history list. This is very, very important. And then finally, we've got last viewed sources. A little but mighty feature request. So this allows you to understand every detail about usage data. This gives you the complete story around user access, when, where, how, etc. So then that way you can make better informed business decisions. All right, I like to see some big eyes because hopefully not only did you learn some advanced techniques today, but you learned some new capability that will help you in your journey in adopting Torii. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. And we have a few questions that are trickling in through the actual Q&A panel. So outside of the webinar chat, feel free to share those. I'm going to facilitate them, and then Steve, if you'll answer. So the first one is, Jean asked, it's really, really important question. They're wondering if we're able to export or import workflows.
Not currently. That's not something we currently have within the product. If you've not already, please submit that feedback. Or if it's there already, please upvote it.
All right. Another one that we have is there a limit to the number of workflows that I can run?
Within Torii, we do not provide you with any limits on the number of workflows, the number of actions you have. If you are licensed for workflows in professional or enterprise, you have full access to use the workflows.
How about on top of that, I'm a heavy workflow user. Should I be concerned about scalability and performance as I continue to grow these workflows and actions?
Torii was built for performance in mind, so there's no issues with scalability.
Great, love to hear that. Okay, another one. Can I use SSO groups and workflow triggers?
Absolutely. You can use SSO groups as part of a trigger, and you'll then be able to then act on that to say, if you're in this group, therefore you're going to then have the subsequent actions. One of the other cool things about SSO groups, since you brought it up, was if you weren't already aware of it, now available in the users tab is the ability, and I'm actually, sorry, I'm just going to jump to that because I really want to show that, I guess now, is when I go back into Torii and I want to look, maybe I'll search for myself. There we go. There's now a details tab, and you now have access to see all the information in here, including your SSO groups, right? I can look in here and also gain that history of changes to that as well. Okay, so yes, you can do that. And also, but to answer that original question, yes, you can use SSO groups within the triggers.
Amazing. All right, so we have time for one more. I want to get you guys out of here on time, and then any remaining questions, we'll go ahead and have the CSMs reach out with an answer. Are there API rate limits that we experience?
Yes, there are API rate limits. And please see the developer community, and there will be an explanation of the rate limits within the developer community.
I'd imagine they may vary per application too, but that's just my assumption.
Well, we're talking about rate limits into Torii. So
okay, thank you.
Torii,
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope this gave you some ideas. I got some good positive feedback in that chat. A reminder, please reach out to your CSM. We're here to help you. They're ready to answer any questions that you may have about what Steve went through today. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll talk soon.